I'm always getting asked by people, when is the best time to test my soil for soil life? So I've made this video to help answer that question and also help you guys understand exactly what's happening in your soil throughout the year so that you can get the most out of it when you're growing your food. So this is actually one of the most frequently asked questions I get, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to give a precise answer because of everything that's happening in the world, but I'll explain a little bit more as we go. Now, the reason it's a good thing to know what's happening in your soil on a microscopic level throughout the year is so that you know exactly what you should be doing or what you shouldn't be doing at certain times so that you can get the most out of what is happening to maximize the benefit to whatever food you're growing. This means adapting or incorporating certain growing practices or activities so that you can really make the absolute best out of what nature has to offer. And what I mean by this is maximizing those natural processes that we're trying to replicate or make even more impactful to all the fruit and veggies that we have in our soil. Now, I said earlier on that this is becoming a really hard question to answer accurately because of things happening in the world, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the video as we go. But for explaining this today, what we're going to do, I'm going to hit the drawing board again, get artistic, and talk you through exactly what's going on. Let's get stuck in. Okay, so hopefully I can do this clearly and concisely. It shouldn't need to take too long. So, learning from previous mistakes, I have already mapped out my axes here for what I will be describing. Along the bottom here, we've got the months of the year, so time, and up the side here, biological activity. And what I mean by that is the microorganisms that are awake, alive, functioning and doing things. There are obviously loads and loads of organisms in the soil at any given time, but not all of them are active. So there is a number of things at play in soil which do ultimately affect activity, and these change throughout the year. And at the beginning of the year, activity is generally low. So we'll start somewhere down here. The reason it's low, one of the main reasons, is due to temperature. Historically, in winter, temperatures are cooler. That means that the soil is cooler, and as a consequence, all those organisms that we're talking about here are less active. They kind of hibernate or go into a temporary period of stasis. So they stop doing all their activity because they know that the conditions aren't great. It's not going to benefit them in the long run. And that's great because at this time of year, most of what we're concerned with growing is in a slow state of growth, and maybe some fruit, vegetables haven't even been planted. So things at the beginning of the year start off pretty slowly. As the temperatures pick up, activity in the soil begins to pick up as well. So the temperature in the soil increases. So the soil type that you have is a huge influencing factor here. Different soil types, and remember in previous videos I've talked about percentage sand, silt, clay. Different soils conduct temperature at different rates. Some might warm up quicker than others, like a sandy soil, for example, can change quite a lot in a relatively short space of time. So as the soil begins to warm, those organisms that were kind of in hibernation begin to become active. And this kind of generally begins to occur sort of early spring, and it continues all the way through mid-spring, kind of to late spring or even early summer. And it is not just temperature that's a factor here. There's usually residual moisture in the soil as well. So we've got the right conditions, we've got the right temperature, we've got the right amount of water in the soil. Hopefully there's some food present as well. So this is why composting for whatever you're growing, actually even foods, is incredibly important. That organic matter will help feed, nourish and drive some of those biological processes. So seasonality is a huge factor here, and as we get towards kind of from early summer into mid to late summer, temperatures are usually at their highest, and so that activity tends to wane a little bit. That's predominantly because things are incredibly warm and the soil moisture content reduces significantly, and that slows everything down. So we kind of reach this peak in mid to late spring, and then kind of mid to late summer things slow right down as the soil dries out. And then as we go from midsummer into late summer, late summer especially, things begin to cool down as we head into autumn, and typically around this time as well, the moisture content begins to change in not only the atmosphere but in the soil as well. And so we end up with lots of activity because we've got the residues of plant material, plant matter from the growing season combined with lower ambient temperatures which kind of percolate through the soil. So again, the thermal dynamics of the particular soil you have play a role in this, and coupled with the moisture, coupled with the temperature, coupled with the foods, things begin to increase again. And sometimes, and what we see in the UK in the samples that we test over here, actually this second kind of peak can often be greater than this initial spring peak. And that continues through kind of autumn until you get to mid to late autumn and head into winter, and things kind of fall off. Now I'm kind of exaggerating this slightly, and then the cycle starts again the next year. Now, I mentioned at the start of this video that things are changing in the world which are kind of having an effect on this, and basically what we're talking about here is kind of seasonality. Quite often this ramp up at the start has occurred a lot earlier in recent years than it ever used to, and very often this kind of lull, if you like, in summer has become elongated. We've kind of hit droughty conditions far earlier in the year, and so often this kind of drought could occur much earlier, even kind of here, and go through a lot later as well. And then you get these kind of massive spells, very short spells, but spells of massive rainfall, high moisture content, and everything kind of swells and uplifts again. And then autumns, we've seen again in recent years, have run a lot later. We've even done soil testing for microbiology as late as December in some years because conditions have been so mild. But as soon as you get that sustained frost or snowfall, things then tend to plunge straight into dormancy, and it's not a great time for testing your soil for soil life. But it's this change in seasons, it's the extremes in weather conditions that are associated with it, which make it very hard to give one flat answer of when is the best time to sample your soil. All I can say is the best time kind of marries up with the bulk of your kind of grow calendar. Things start to increase biologically as roots start to grow on your crops, and that's great. You know, you can get an early test perhaps at the beginning of the year and use that to inform what changes you might make later in the year, bearing in mind you'll obviously be hitting that test kind of on the upward trajectory. Similarly, kind of peak growing season, it's at its low time. By then the crop, whatever you're growing, is kind of set, and you'll already be harvesting anyway, so you can kind of say, well, what little use is it? I guess what I'm kind of saying is there is this pattern, there's these twin peaks. Sometimes the peaks start a bit earlier, sometimes they start a bit later. It's really understanding the pattern over time as to how these things change, how to predict and use that to inform your activities around your crops and understand what's happening with your soil. So in summary, as you've seen, there really are two key phases of the year to test your soil. That is beginning of the year, mid to late spring, and towards the end, mid to late autumn. And the reason these times are great is because the soil is generally at its most biologically active. That means that more of the organisms that it contains are alive, active, functioning, carrying out their little processes, and so we get a really good measure of what the soil is biologically capable of. Now, if you sample your soil outside of these times, that is also fine, but if there are some problems that you detect, whether it's finding out that you have a low biomass or your soil's particularly biologically deficient in one way or the other, you'll never quite know whether that relates to just inactivity because the conditions you're looking at the soil within are not optimal, or you won't know if those organisms were just simply not there in the first place. So of course, once you do know the biological potential of your soil and you look at it under those optimal conditions at either end of the year, you'll have a good idea of what is or isn't present and what you need to do about it. When you're growing food, fruit, vegetables, plants, you can also use the knowledge that you've gained of what's happening in the soil at these key times of year as well to plan certain activities. For example, adding compost to your soil at a time when you know the soil is at its most biologically active. You know that there are the organisms sat there waiting, ready to cycle over whatever organic matter you add and convert it as quickly as they can into foods for your plants. And so this can help you increase or improve the vitality of your food crops at key times of the year by making sure that you add those reserves at the key points in the growing season. So there we go, everyone. That wraps this video up. I hope you found it useful. If you liked it, please do show it by giving it a thumbs up. Also, I would love it if you consider subscribing to the channel. Stay tuned for more videos. See you soon.